When it comes to the wealthiest men on the planet, today's top earners are tech billionaires, such as Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates. However, the wealthiest businessman to have ever lived passed away nearly a century ago. In today's video, we'll take a look at a business empire so vast that even after a century of technological progress, no man has succeeded in outperforming its founder. This is the history of Standard Oil, the most powerful oil company during the 19th century. The origins of history's most powerful oil monopoly are actually quite modest. Everything begins in 1839 with the birth of John Rockefeller, who was born in upstate New York. He was the eldest son of a merchant on the road who self-identified as a botanic physician, but was actually selling the 19th century equivalent of homeopathic medicine. He would be gone for weeks at a time, and in fact, would have multiple children with another woman, whom he decided to bring home with him so that they could all live together as one big happy family. In this perplexing household, John would grow up learning how to con people for money and how to get the best possible deal. He learned how to make the most of every penny he had. His family rarely stayed in one place for a long time, and from the age of 3, John was forced to live this nomadic lifestyle with the rest of his family. To help his mother, John was willing to work for any amount that he could get his hands on, and would do so by raising turkeys or working odd jobs for their neighbors. His intelligence came in handy when in 1854 the family relocated to Cleveland, Ohio, where he had the opportunity to attend a proper school. However, John dropped out less than a year later in order to work as a bookkeeper in a local produce shop. He would earn 50 cents per day, which at the time was also a very small amount of money, and would work with other businesses as a side job too. However, after 2 years of working there, his superiors refused to give him a significant raise, so he decided to outdo them by starting his own personal produce brokerage. He was able to obtain a loan of $4,000 because of his good reputation, which was considered quite a large sum at the time. John began trading hay, grain, meat, and other commodities, and he made $500,000 worth of sales in his first year, of which he only received a small percentage as commissions. However, it was still a resounding success. Every bank in Cleveland begged John to borrow money from them. He was just 18 years old at the time. But then, in 1859, something happened that would change everything. He would forever alter his life. The first oil well in the United States had been discovered at a lake about 100 miles east of Cleveland. This was the start of the Pennsylvania oil rush, with oil production of 4,500 barrels in a year. Oil wasn't quite as valuable back then as it is today. Gasoline automobiles had not yet been invented. Nonetheless, oil could still be processed into kerosene, which was then used in lamps. However, John realized that the biggest profits to be had were not in oil drilling, but in its refinement. He had seen many people go bankrupt before he knew that the business of striking oil was too risky and too dangerous for him. Instead, he delegated the task to others. He would save himself the trouble of finding the oil and purchase it from them instead. John had to wait until 1863 for the government to construct a rail line connecting Pennsylvania with the oil fields to Cleveland. When that line was finally completed, John was prepared, along with a long list of partners and financial institutions ready to assist him. He also gathered a group of experienced chemists, as well as engineers who would only optimize the process of refinement, but also discovered various uses for petroleum by refining its byproducts. You see, Cleveland's early refineries could only run at about 60% efficiency. However, John did not increase that percentage. He also began selling all byproducts such as naphtha, tar, and paraffin wax. Within 2 years, the Rockefeller refinery, one of the largest in Cleveland at the time, was completed. It was worth more than $70,000. However, John was not finished. In 1865, there were 26 competing refineries in Cleveland, But within 5 years, all but 4 had been acquired by John Rockefeller. His company had grown too large for a partnership to handle on its own by this point, so in 1870, he established Standard Oil of Ohio. In order to persuade the few remaining competitors, John would simply invite them to Cleveland, bring them over, and show them his books, revealing to them that he could operate at a loss for a much longer period of time that they might be able to survive. In exchange for a fair purchase price, John would provide his competitors with positions in his own businesses, thereby attracting the brightest minds in the industry that he controls. Of course, not everyone would give up right away, and John gradually lowered the price of oil and kerosene, sometimes up to 80%, in order to strangle rivals. Unsurprisingly, his strategy was successful. By 1880, he had purchased refineries throughout the Northeast U.S. and was refining more than 90% of the total oil production in the country. John was so powerful at this point that he would invite the owners of the major railroads, as well as personally negotiating rebates for their locomotives in back rooms of offices. For most people at the time, and still kind of today, rail was used to transport industrial goods, and many large industrialists became concerned that John's use of transportation rebates may be illegal. They were worried that John would come after and acquire their businesses as well. Over the next decade, business leaders, politicians, and the media would lash out at Standard Oil, increasing the ferocity as time went on. Ohio legislators began drafting antitrust legislation. Rockefeller was brought down by regulators, but he was one step ahead of everyone else. He reincorporated in New Jersey in 1882, at this time established the Standard Oil Trust. As a result, he owned stakes in over 40 local businesses. Then, to demonstrate his success, John constructed his company's impressive headquarters on Broadway. This was the pinnacle of Rockefeller's career. He owned 200,000 oil wells, 4,000 miles of pipeline, and employed over 100,000 people. However, his grip on the oil industry was slipping both domestically and internationally. Massive oil reserves that were discovered in Russia and Asia were being developed by the Rothschild family, who spared no expense in getting that oil to America. Worse, the federal government that was established in 1890 passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which provided politicians the means to go after the Standard Oil Trust. Of course, the complex legal structure behind all the companies was very difficult to investigate, which is why the government couldn't actually break up the Standard Oil until 1911. However, by that time, John Rockefeller had already cashed out and was no longer actively managing the business. During the final 20 years of his firm's existence, it had paid out more than $500 million in dividends. By some estimates, the true worth of Standard Oil at its peak was $1 trillion, so the breakup didn't really come as a surprise to most people. In 1911, the Supreme Court found Standard Oil guilty of anti-competitive practices and broke the company up into 34 separate entities. Of course, John Rockefeller kept his stake in those companies until his death, and in fact, it turns out that the breakup was the most profitable event in his life. You see, over time, many of those companies merged back with one another. Today, most of the Standard remnants are part of either ExxonMobil, Chevron, or BP, which have since become incredibly large companies in their own right. John Rockefeller's ownership of these successor companies made him the richest businessman to ever have lived, with an estimated net worth of $400 billion. Even today, no one has beaten Rockefeller on the leaderboard. Not even Elon Musk himself seems likely to achieve that. Thanks for watching. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more videos about your favorite wealthy families are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.